Hi everyone, welcome to the Brown History Podcast. My name is Essen, and this is episode 13. On today's episode, our guest is Hari Kondabolu. He is an American stand-up comic. He has a special on Netflix right now, and he is a director of a documentary called The Problem with Apu. So to give you a quick context of that documentary, in 2017, Hari Kondabolu releases this documentary. And it's basically a documentary about Apu from The Simpsons and how it's impacted American society and the effect it has on South Asians growing up in America or anywhere around the world. The documentary created change because Hank Azaria, the voice who does Apu, who's also white, stepped down from his role, and the creators of The Simpsons responded, and not just responded by a tweet or anything, but they literally responded through an episode of The Simpsons. So we're going to talk about all that and some more. If you're enjoying the show and you're enjoying the page and you want to help out, just visit www.brownhistorypodcast.com. It helps a lot and it goes a long way. Thank you so much for your support. And stick around. It's going to be a great episode. Here we go.
They don't even meet the two sides. And it's I've done both. I mean, being a comedian feels so long ago already, man.
Really? What? Oh, because of the pandemic.
Yeah, I haven't done stand-up since March, and who knows when I'm going to do it again. And I'm not one of those who wants to find a way to do it and do a distance thing and have, or people, some stands are putting people in cars and they're beeping at punchlines, and or like we're in a room but there's no drinks or food and everyone's separated by 10 feet. I'm like, I'll just wait to do the real thing. And I'm not into like Zoom shows if I can avoid it.
You want to go the old traditional way?
I want to do it the way, I mean, I didn't sign up to do any of this other stuff. I signed up to be a stand-up, and when I'm on I have done Zoom shows, and when I do these Zoom shows, it just feels like I'm being the funny guy on a conference call. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't feel like stand-up in the slightest, and
true,
not what I signed up for either.
Well, you are doing a podcast. You've got a podcast going on.
Yeah, that's a
podcast. Not, I don't know if it's funny or not, but
it's funny.
More political.
It's funny. It's both. Certainly it's much more focused on our points of view and our values more than. My stand-up is very much my who I am, what I believe, but at the same time, the joke is the whole goal is punchlines, right? With the podcast, it's being informative, learning something, and teaching what you've learned to other people. So it's kind of a different thing, but the art of stand-up, right now is not it's not in good shape because we just can't get out there. But
is that giving you anxiety? Because I don't know if it's with all comedians, but from what I understand, comedians have this kind of compulsion to need a laughter, to need kind of like to perform.
It definitely feels weird not to be able to express myself in the way I'm used to expressing myself and receiving laughter the way I've gotten it for 20 years. I've been doing this a long time, so it just feels like everything's a little out of whack. And it's not to say I can't function without it. And I have enough creative projects and the podcasts I'm doing, and certainly there's a creative itch that's being scratched, but it's not. Stand-up is its own special thing. There's a reason why people like Jon Stewart or like these super famous comics who've made tons of money and are really successful in film or in TV go back to stand-up, because they did it for stand-up to begin with. Mm-hmm. The whole goal of all the other stuff many times was, how do I get notable enough where more people come to my shows live? And that's a stand-up impulse. Like, sometimes that changes over time, and certainly I have a family now, and that change, certainly you think about things not just in terms of how do I do stand up again, but also like how does that fit into make money and fit into my family life. But stand up is always something that is so ever present also. And I think this speaks to like all stand-ups to some degree, but I think especially if you're like a person of color or in any marginalized group, like you can say what you want in stand-up. You're not dependent on other people giving you the ability to broadcast yourself. Like, especially if you're like a minority, waiting for most often like white tastemakers to give you an opening, or white gatekeepers to give you an opening, to like actually be on TV or to publish your thing or to put you on a show, whatever it is, right? The idea that with stand-up you can just go on stage and talk
Yeah,
is very liberating.
but that's now. That's like, in this modern day time. And you've been doing comedy for
No,
a
no, no.
long time.
Even
Even
before,
back then, even in the 2000s and the 90s.
before that, man, Richard Pryor, all these comics from the 70s, 60s, and 70s, stand up was a way for them, because if everything is based on capitalism and making money, you're looking at a time period, before the internet age, where you're thinking there's 4 or 5 major networks, movies cost a lot of money. You're not thinking about the minority audience, right? You're obviously thinking about mainstream white America, for example, and what's going to reach mainstream white America. And it's not going to be depictions that are accurate, or stories of people of color that are different, or stories that are different than what their norm is, right? They don't think that's going to bring them money, so they pick the safest bet. With stand-up, you're able to go on stage, you sell tickets, you draw crowds. That's hard to argue with. Mm-hmm. So if you're somebody who's selling out giant arenas or big rooms, if you're someone who makes a TV show or a film, like, well, this product's been tested and it's successful. If you're like, back then, especially if you're like a good looking white person or a white person that's accessible to people, you don't need to prove it the same way. You're going to get a chance. But if you're in a marginalized group, you better prove that you actually have some draw, some pull. And stand-up has always given us that. That's why you notice, like in other, like even in previous eras, it's always comics, comedians who are people of color who are able to rise a lot more than maybe their peers in drama, right? While like you have people playing terrible roles, as actors, comedians, like there's something about that. People, if you could make people laugh, they forgive you for a lot. They give you a lot more room, and that was true then. It's true now. Now at least you have more chances to, because media has been fragmented. Mm-hmm. We're not looking at 4 networks. Like there's a million different places where you can share your story, and people aren't worried about having the biggest audience. They're hoping to have a audience because, there's a million places you can broadcast. So it's like, oh, well, Asians have money. Why don't we get people that appeal to them, and they'll pay their money, and their money's as good as everyone else's money. Like it became a very different calculation. But that being said, stand-up is like the freest art form in so many ways, because it's direct to audience. If you have something to say, music's incredible. People can make political music, and if the hook's good enough, people aren't even paying attention. If they like the music, they don't know. People are, you have, like, I'm sure racists and conservatives loving Rage Against the Machine. It's like everything they're about is against what you believe in, but you're not paying attention because you buy into the sound. And comedy doesn't give you that in the same way. No, like it's a lot more blunt. So I miss that. I miss that very much.
Do you have a lot to say now?
I just talked for the last 10 minutes in a row. So clearly, as in, like, I'm hungry to say something, because you didn't ask me many questions, and I've already answered 5 questions that you didn't even ask me.
You took me off guard, man. You just went straight for it. Usually it's like a little build-up, but I hate talking to comedians because they're so smart and they're so witty and on top of their game. I can't keep up. I get freaked out. But it's kind of easy because the topic is you, right? You're the topic of the discussion. So I kind of want to, start from your roots and kind of go and follow your path to where you are now. And I kind of want to really focus on the, your parents and your child upbringing, and because we don't really hear the immigration story.
Sure.
So I wanted to know, like, where your dad grew up and your mom grew up and how they met.
My folks are both from southern India. My mother was born in a small town, which a small town in India is still like hundreds of thousands of people. So like it's not a village. It's still it's bigger than that, but it's not a city, but it's still huge. It's a town called Tenali, which is in Andhra Pradesh, the state of Guntur. And my father also grew up in Andhra Pradesh, except now the state split. So he's technically on the Telangana side, in an area called Somwaram, I guess the closest cities would be like Waira and Khammam. And so, yeah, they grew up like kind of in, even though it's the same state, it's very different. Like my dad grew up in a much more rural setting, more farming, stuff like that. And my mom grew up again, like in a town. So it's not a city, but still there were more, you had colleges, it's more of an educated elite. There's theater and all this other stuff. So, it was seen as a cultural hub, even though it was a town, it wasn't a city. So kind of very different settings. Mom was a doctor.
Wow.
Which especially, as a young Indian woman in the 70s to, finish your education, then go even further and have your own practice in a small town. Like my mom very much broke a lot of, she definitely defied expectations. And I think for a lot of younger women probably looked up to my mom.
That's
younger women probably saw her as like, oh, she like, in addition, my mom was also really tall, especially for an Indian woman. So I think there's this, she stood out to begin with, but I think that plus like, oh, she succeeded and she was able to do, this incredible thing. And she was a doctor in a town that didn't have any women doctors. So her presence there was huge for the women in that community. My father, his background originally was in botany, which, as you can imagine, is not the most employable. It's certainly a farming background. His father was a politician who was still like very notable in that area. My grandfather was a well-respected politician in the area on my dad's side. On my mom's side, my grandfather was a very well-respected professor. Humanities professor, law, things like that. And so my father eventually comes to America because his sister got here first, sponsored the rest of the family,
you were born
story.
in India.
No, I was born here. So my parents hadn't met yet. My dad came to America first in the late 70s, lived with his brother, initially in Kansas and then New York City. Dad, yeah, I know, it's wild, right? I have cousins in Kansas. Like my, one of my, the aunt that came here first is still there and her kids are still there. And the rest of the family spread out mostly to New York. And Dad made, his life working initially in his late 20s, mid to late 20s, working at a drugstore, doing odd jobs. Like, he's an immigrant trying to cut it, and eventually, takes some courses to be an echocardiogram technician, and ends up having an incredible career doing that. Like he was very good in his particular field. My parents had an arranged marriage, so the families didn't know each other, but especially back then, it was like there was somebody they both trusted, and both of them were getting a little older, which at the time was late 20s is like older. Like now it's like people in the late 30s and early 40s getting married. Back then you're ancient if you're 26 and unmarried. So it's like different era.
Especially for a woman. Oh
my God. Like, my mom has been very open with me about the fact that like, that wasn't, getting married was not necessarily on her list of goals. If you're going to go to med school for that many years and work, she was very focused on what she was doing. But so they got married, moved to the US, to New York, had me and my brother. Mom ended up never being a doctor in the US. I mean, it's one of those things where it required a great deal of, in order to become a doctor from that point, it wasn't like an automatic transfer. No, it would require exams and a bunch of other stuff. And you're raising two kids. That's not the easiest thing in the world. So,
in a new world, in a new country.
In a new country where she's figuring everything out.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my parents' story. Brother and I grew up in Queens, New York.
Did your mom like instill a good kind of like understanding of the world and kind of push you to work ethic and all these things?
Both of them did the work ethic. Like my father and mother, my dad, being an echocardiogram technician, it's not a white collar job. It's not necessarily a blue collar job. It's like one of those jobs where you get paid pretty solid. It's a good solid job, but it's a union job still.
Right.
Which is great, right? Like it's still like, it's not management in the same way, it's still under the union. And so, pay was solid, but my dad worked like 6 or 7 other jobs. He worked on weekends till I was like in my 20s. Like he really like busted his butt for something bigger. And my mom, you know, like every working mother, it's like you have your job. She eventually started working at a cath lab and worked still, you know, in medicine, but not as a doctor. So she worked as a lab manager, and it was actually a union job. And between that and raising the two of us, you know, women often have that second unpaid job that sometimes is even more work than the job they're getting paid for. Mm-hmm. And so the two of them were just working and keeping it together, and it was hard, you know, and it's very typical of it's not like a unique story that I have in terms of parents who are working constantly and, you know, either by example or clearly like, you know, telling us like, you know, hard work was what was going to get us anywhere, whatever it was we were going to do. I don't think comedy was really in that, but
which is the unique story here, is that one of their sons decides to become a comedian and the other son goes into music, and you became a comedian during a time when people that look like you aren't really on TV at all. And I remember seeing you as a kid, you know, just flashes of you here and there in bits and pieces, but we didn't have internet at that time, so I couldn't like Google your name or anything.
Sure.
You are. But when I saw you, I was like, whoa, like there's a brown guy here, and his name doesn't sound brown. I don't know. Is he brown? Because you have a last name I've never heard before.
It's a South Indian name.
Yeah, it's a South Indian, so I wasn't really sure. It wasn't a name that you would see in like Bollywood movies, right? Mm-hmm. So grow up in Montreal was a really big deal, and I couldn't follow you. I couldn't find where you were, and the jokes that you were saying at that time, I didn't really understand it, because your jokes aren't like dumb jokes. They're very political, and they're deep. You know what I mean? Like, it's funny, and then it makes you think after. And at the time, I didn't understand the context of the world I was living in.
Of course. You kidding me? Like, whenever I have a kid who's like 15 or 16 tell me how much they love my stand-up, I'm shocked, because I would have hated me when I was 15 or 16. Like, I didn't like the things I talk about, how I approach stand-up. I'm very long form. Some would say long-winded. So it kind of, if you're like 16 and you don't know what's going on in the world, and your world is basically what you've learned from media and TV or whatever and the internet, and this guy's coming and talking about stuff almost like a teacher, like I could imagine like you know, I was never really meant for everyone from the get-go. Not quite from the get-go, but pretty early on I kind of decided where I wanted to go with it. And you know, I'm surprised that it's taken me this far. Maybe some of that is cultural changes that people
I think
are more...
you were ahead of your time. I think you were a lot ahead of your time. I go back to your jokes, and now I get it, and I'm like, wow, that is so much more accurate and so much more, you know, deeper. And I don't know, I think you were just ahead of your times. Because after you, from what I remember, Russell Peters came on board, and that was a really big deal.
Well, Russell was there first, man.
Was he?
Russell... Oh no, Russell is old. Like, he's like first generation.
He was in South Africa, I think, really big, but
he was huge in Canada, man. He hosted the Juno Awards. Like,
Did he was before him?
Well after him.
Oh, really?
Decades after, yeah. Like Russell, like he is like OG, man. Like that dude, like that dude worked the road in Canada for a lot of years. And what happened was he had a Comedy Now special that took off online before things became viral. Now, like, you have YouTube and all these other ways, but there was no YouTube like in the early 2000s. There was like Napster, and there was all these other file sharing services. So a lot of Desis and other Asians, like, you know, had high-speed internet connections and shit. And so we would put clips online, and other Desis at colleges and other places would pass them around. And it was amazing because we'd never seen a brown comic. So I saw Russell Peters when I was like, I don't know, like 17, 18, 19. And I was stunned. It was like the greatest thing. Like, oh my God, there's one of us that exists, and he does stand up, but it's in Canada. I can't believe this guy exists. and he was touring the UK and South Africa and all over the place. And once that special leaked viral, before viral was even a thing, all of a sudden he's coming down to New York and LA and his rooms are packed. Like, he was a guy that nobody knew down here. And once that thing leaked, like, he inspired a generation of comics to do it. He gave a lot of us hope, like, oh, you can actually make it. Just because you're brown, like, it doesn't mean that this avenue's closed to you. This is in Canada, but still there's that little bit of room that, like, maybe this could be here too. So no, he's definitely a generation before me. Like, there's other people in that era too in the US, like Aladdin Ullah, Vijay Nathan. Like, there's a ton of people that came like before me by anywhere from 5 to 10 or plus years. And then I came up, and like with me, like my era would have been like me, Aziz Ansari,
Right.
Kumail Nanjiani. Like, that's all around the same time. Shortly after that, you get Aparna Nancherla and Hassan Minhaj and like people like that. But that we're not that first generation for sure. And I was in that second wave that still didn't see us on TV very much, but felt like maybe we had something to share. So yeah, I mean, I think I was probably the first to get really, political in a mainstream way. I know Aladdin did some of that, but like, certainly I think I'm the one that like kind of was able to break through first with some of the kind of ideas I had. But and it's nice to know that like the people that have come after me like cite me as an influence. Like, that's a good feeling. But yeah, I was definitely not the first.
And you did a documentary on The
Yeah.
Simpsons.
Yeah.
You basically kind of murdered Apu.
That's what they say. It's the thing is, I don't even think they killed the character. I think that they're not using him very much. And the guy who voices it said he didn't want to voice it anymore after seeing the documentary and giving it a think. It's weird because the story is really, the documentary, most people even haven't even seen the documentary. So like the people who hate it the most haven't seen it. It's what they've heard about it. It's about being a fan of something and at the same time disagreeing with an element of it. And it's not to say you don't love the thing. It means you're critical of it because you care about it, because it's worth something to you. And also it's about like being brown and only having one thing, like nothing else. Mm-hmm. The only thing that represents you and your family and your ancestry is a cartoon voiced by a white guy. There's nothing else. If there's other things, then at least you have, well, I won't watch this, I'll watch that. But this is it. It's on the show that defines like an era for a lot of us. Like, it was the show we all grew up watching. And, for me, it taught me so much about comedy and TV and jokes. And a lot of my heroes wrote for that show. And like, it's a very important show. And so it was that weird thing of, man, like, this show's so great, but I'm like in high school and I have to wince every time I see Apu, because I know that that's going to be, instead of being something that is a source of pride, it's going to be a source of embarrassment. Initially, it was exciting because we had nothing. So you see a brown face, even if it's paint and it's a cartoon, and you're like, oh man, they know we exist. That's all you want. Like, when you're not invited to the table, like, you're happy with scraps. But after a while, it's like, I'm an American. I was born here. I grew up in New York. I don't see any of my friends and family and people I care about represented. It's not fair. You expect more. And when you don't get more and you get ridiculed, it's like, this is a lose-lose. Like, you want us to take a joke, which we're taking, but you never give us a chance to make a joke back. You never give us a chance to talk for ourselves.
Yeah.
What do you think it's going to lead to? It's going to lead to it leads to a couple of things. I think it leads to people who are frustrated, don't think it's fair, want to have a chance to speak and make jokes and do our thing and have things that represent us and not other people's view of us. And I think it leads to also the kind of Daisy that doesn't want to deal with the confrontation, laughs along with it, as I did at some point, and gets angry that I made the film. You're making us look weak. You're making us look like we can't take a joke. And I'm like, we took a joke a long time, man. I'm talking about us talking back.
That's the answer you got from the South Asian community?
No, I got both of those. I got people who felt proud and felt like this is something we've needed a long time. And I'm proud. I'm happy my kids can see this. And I wish I had this and somebody who was able to say this before. And I got the other people who were like, you're embarrassing us, take a joke. I love the fact that he's an immigrant. He's a good role model for our community. He's a good representation. I'm like, how brainwashed are you? Like,
Yes.
nobody is watching that show and hearing his accent and leaving, that's funny, and what a great role model for the South Asian community. Like, nobody's thinking that.
No.
And, I think when you are outnumbered and you don't have, like, I grew up around a lot of brown people. I grew up in Queens, New York. I grew up with a sense of identity and pride. And it's not to say I didn't deal with racism. It's not to say I didn't deal with ridicule. And it's not to say I didn't have my own angst over what I was in this country. But I knew that I had I knew I was grounded in something and I could see it in my communities. If you grew up in a place without brown people, without anybody who stood their ground in that way culturally, and you were just trying to fit in, you were trying not to rock the boat, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to say whatever you're being fed, and you're going to be like, well, this is how you fit in, and you laugh and you go along with it and you play their game. And eventually that becomes something you're not even intentionally doing anymore. You become very conditioned into believing that whatever they're saying is right. And it's all just a joke, and it doesn't matter. And I've always been in the camp, and my parents have shown me this either by expressing it or by example. Like, you have pride in yourself. It's not that you can't take a joke. You have pride in who you are, and you don't let someone get away with degrading you or lowering your dignity. You stand up for yourself. And that doesn't necessarily mean violence, but that certainly means that you don't stay silent. It's a funny thing because my parents were two-sided on that. Because on one side, they didn't want me to cause trouble. They don't want me to don't do anything that would affect your grades or your career prospects, Right. And at the same time, my kid deserves respect. It's a tricky line, but that was always something, that stood with me. Like, I deserve the same respect as my peers, and why should I get any less?
The Simpsons response at the end, right? They put they get Lisa Simpson to say something which was along the lines of, why should something that was funny a long time ago not be, something that wasn't offensive a long time ago shouldn't be offensive anymore? Let it go.
It's essentially, yeah. It was.
How'd you like that answer?
It speaks a lot to white fragility. Right? It's like they didn't even need to, if you're that, I made a documentary on a cable network that most people didn't see. And you're a multi-million, maybe billion-dollar, organization, right? Like, your show is global and you've done all these things. You can ignore me. It goes away. You know what I mean? Whatever dent I can make, your silence will... You write it out. There's no reason to deal with me. I wasn't trying to troll them, but if I was, I won because they responded.
Yeah, which is cool, by the way.
Well, the fact they responded, I think it says a lot to the criticism they were getting, but also to the fact they couldn't handle the criticism. Because you can either ignore it or you can handle it as thoughtfully as possible as comedy writers. What is the best angle to take on this idea? Do we want to respond? If we respond, what does that look like? The way they responded was half-assed, political correctness sucks, this guy sucks, get over it. That was essentially what it was. And also, it's clear that nobody, who was head of that show watched the documentary, and Matt Groening probably didn't either, but they all had points of view on it. And so, ultimately, it was kind of a fuck you to people who even questioned it, and it ended up backfiring because even if you disagreed with me and you like The Simpsons, it's clear that point of view is not a Simpsons way of handling it.
No.
That it's very fragile. Lisa is if you were going to use the phrase politically correct social justice warrior, that's Lisa Simpson's character, basically.
Yeah.
So for her to say that is not being... it's not it's not doing the character justice. It's inconsistent. So, I think it's sad because everything at some point, I think, can become the status quo. And at one point you have a piece of art it's also a piece of commerce that's like somewhat radical, is controversial, is making these political jokes, is making these pop cultural jokes, and is critiquing things. And it's, I mean, it influenced me greatly. It made me believe that you could be smart and funny, you know, like that was one of those shows, because there was jokes that people got, like, and there was jokes that super fans got, that like subtle little things that I would only get later, you know, if you watched it 3 or 4 times. And it's like, wow, like that, like the depth of that. But you know, once you make enough money and once you have any degree of influence or power, you run the risk of, you know, no longer being relevant and being like reinforcing the old guard. And that's kind of what you saw. It's a bunch of old white dudes who see themselves as liberal, who can't take criticism or don't know how to respond to it. You know, hearing things like, I'm sure we agree on 99% of things, but I'm like, that's not what the issue is. This isn't about our overall values. This is about a point of contention. This is about a specific thing. And yeah, I'm sure we agree on a lot of stuff because I'm a fan of the show. But this is, you know, it's, you know, the funny thing is they kept calling it a controversy. It's not a controversy. This has been around for 30 years. You just didn't hear us before. People have been, you know, saying shit about Apu, you know, like anyone who's brown, this didn't shock them. Like, what? They make fun of us? What do you mean? They make fun of brown people? That didn't shock us. We deal with that shit. It wasn't like, good thing you made a documentary. Otherwise, me as a brown person would not know that we deal with racism. Like, to us, it's not, it was more people were happy that it existed, that this documentary existed, but it didn't shock them into, I can't believe this has happened, or this is the way they treat us. It was news for everybody else. You know, it wasn't a controversy. It was updating everybody on where we are. And that's another thing I see a lot. Like, you know, what that documentary is, or shows like Fresh Off the Boat or other pieces of media that have come out in recent years, I watch certain things. I'm like, you know what? This story is an old story. Like the Apu thing's an old story that finally got attention, right?
Yeah.
But they ignored us or didn't let us talk for so long. Our old shit is new to them. The stuff we weren't allowed to talk about 20 years ago is new to them. It's not new to us.
True.
I'm excited about that next level when we can make jokes or tell stories from our perspective without having to explain everything constantly, because they actually are invested enough to know who we are. And that's the next level, which I think we're getting to, where we actually can you know, tell our stories genuinely and not without the thought of, well, white people get this. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if white people get it. They can get it if they want to get it. Google means you can get anything if you want to. You know what I mean?
Yeah. What for me, for that documentary, what I really loved the most about it was that question you asked all the other South Asian comedians that included Hassan Minaj, and you're like,
Yeah.
were you bullied? You know, was Apu used as a tool to bully you? And everybody raised their hand, and
Yeah.
I just felt like, wow, you too, like, you know, like like Alcohol Anonymous, like a community, we're all in this together. That unity, that we're all against this kind of enemy, you know, that was what, you know, stuck out for me.
Yeah. And you know what's funny is that's another thing where, you know, you knew people didn't see the documentary who hated it because people are like, you're the only one who has a complaint. And it's like, if you saw the documentary, no, I pretty much got the whole, you know, I got the whole gang together for that. You can't really argue. And it's people that are old school and current day, like, who are making art saying the same shit.
Part of growing up South Asian in America is dealing with Apu back in the day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Isn't that crazy that that's part of the experience of every South Asian in second generation South Asian in America and Canada?
Oh, yeah. And it's news to them. It's not news to us. Like, we knew this. And that's, I mean, again, the documentary is like, you know, it was nice to know I wasn't alone. And at the same time, it was kind of a bummer. Like, you dealt with this too. You know, it's like that.
That's not true. That's not true, because all the people you were interviewing and talking to, you guys are all like a cool gang. You guys are like the cool gang. The rest of us,
I guess that's true.
You know, so it's like you too, and look where you've reached, and look how strong and brave you guys are. Okay, so this is okay. Everything's okay. There's hope. You know.
I mean, we're in a good era, brother. I think this is an era where in terms of art, we're gonna be able to expand boundaries, and because look, even though things have improved, we're still at a certain level where, what are the stories primarily? It's mostly straight Indian men, right? Because those are the most accessible. We need more stories from women. Minnie Kaling alone can't do it, right?
Oh.
We need more people who are LGBTQ to have their stories. We need more immigrant stories, not the stories of first generation people born here, but the people who came, like, immigrants, like my parents' generation, oftentimes they're props, or they're used to tell our stories, but they have stories. In fact, their stories are probably more interesting than ours, because they actually had to leave a place, start over from scratch. That's the story. So, there's, like I was saying, there's all these old stories that haven't been told. There's a ton of things that are much more interesting and unique, and that's what I'm excited about. When do we get there? Because look, man, I think, like, whether it's me or Hassan or Kumail or, Russell, like, there's something familiar. It's like, oh, this is a straight dude, telling stories that I think other men can relate to primarily, and has an immigrant experience, but it's very, like, comfortable. And in a way, I'm not saying that we're not doing anything interesting, but there's something more comfortable in that than a strong-willed woman.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where progress is. When you start getting, like, strong-willed, powerful women getting more attention in our community to share their stories. And when you get more people who are LGBTQ in the mainstream sharing their stories, and their stories get normalized. This is part of our life too. Our story, like, one more last thing on this idea, but people would say, when I was talking about the Apu thing, it's like, well, the show is full of stereotypes, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's a stereotype of, a bad kid, stereotype of a bully, the stereotype of a cop and of a politician. And I'm like, yeah, but here's the thing with that. All those characters can be brown too. Those aren't characteristics. Those aren't racial identifiers.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for us, it's like, it's a stereotype of a brown person, but that's that's turning us into just this. You could have a brown cop, you could have a brown mayor, you could have other characters, and we could be that too, but you can't even imagine us as that. Everything is about his brownness, the way they see it. And the punchlines are about him and his Indianness. And it's not to say the character hasn't been developed and is interesting, but, just the argument that it's stereotypes, it's all about, what those stereotypes show us. I think often show us about the oppressor. What they tell us often is, well, every stereotype has a hint of truth in it, right? They always say that, like, every stereotype has a little bit of truth. The thing they don't think, but every stereotype gives us a bit of truth about the people who share the stereotype, what they believe when they see us, what they imagine when they see us. That's the part I don't think we can let go. When you see us as servile on some level. And when you see us, you're surprised that we speak without an accent. And when you see us, you don't think we're capable of getting to your level. That's in, like, all these stereotypes. And I think we forget that sometimes, that, like, it's not, they put it on us. Well, this is true, isn't it? Isn't this true about your people? And it's like, well, what does that say about your people who view us this way? I think we have to question that.
That's amazing. Yeah, you're right. That's crazy. What would you say about people like Bobby Jindal? Jindal? Who is Bobby Jindal? I'm
I
Canadian.
mean, Bobby Jindal is a Indian American politician, was the governor of Louisiana, conservative. I think that speaks to the thing I was saying before about, like, what do you have to do to fit in?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that his values are all as the result of assimilation and what he thinks is the best way to fit in. But I am saying that, like, there is some of that, but I am saying that, like, in order for him to gain power, he chose a particular track. And, it's one that does not come at, like, there's a cost to be paid, because he's certainly, like, when he's talking about immigration in ways, that are very, in my opinion, anti-immigrant, and does not respect the journey of immigrants, that to me is like, oh, you're selling us all out. Now you can say, well, our parents came legally. First of all, that's not true for all brown people to begin with. Secondly, why does legal status make someone innately better? That just means they got lucky. Mm-hmm. They got lucky to be born into a family where they got an education, where they were even able to get a visa. Also, like, look, it's not to say our parents didn't struggle, not to say my parents didn't struggle. My father had to start over. He had to get a job. He had to get another degree. He had to work hard. But my father didn't have to go through a desert. Mm-hmm. My father didn't have to hide on a boat. My dad didn't have to, pay smugglers all his money and then be left in the desert. I mean, what is the hard, what I mean? What is the harder thing to do? Like, if you want to prove you're loyal to a place, or if you want to prove that you really want to be somewhere, isn't crawling through a desert the bigger challenge than simply, doing your job for 20 or 30 years? And it's not to disrespect people who came with legal status and, with papers and all that, and who worked their asses off. But it's to say that, like, why are we, like, disrespecting stories of people who also are struggling, who also, had a rough time getting here, and whose stories are as powerful, if not more powerful. And a guy like Bobby Nadal, he separates us. He separates immigrants from each other, because he makes this thing about a legal thing versus, like, what is human dignity? What does that have to do with paperwork? What does human dignity have to do with paperwork? And so to me, like, there's people like that who I get frustrated by, because they're concerned with rights in terms of rights mandated by the state, right? These are the laws of this land. These are the rights that we give you. But that's not the same thing as human rights, and that's not the same thing as human dignity that every human being has. And I feel like, to me, when we focus on, like, laws like that, we're forgetting our greater connection to humanity. I'm a human being before I'm anything else. I'm a human being before I'm Hindu. I'm a human being before I'm a man. I'm a human being before I'm an American. That's the thing. And to me, anybody who violates that idea, who works against that idea, is no friend of mine.
He's pretty. I mean, you started a Twitter that went viral, a hashtag.
Yeah.
Mujindo was so white. That blew up. I didn't know who that was until I saw that Twitter hashtag a long time ago. That was really cool.
That was fun. It was fun. That was another one of those, like, everybody chipped in on. It was nice.
Seems like you're doing things to take people with power down.
I mean, it felt like it was also a unifying thing. Like, I'm like, oh shit, brown Twitter exists. Like, that was the first time I knew that we had our own little connection like that. Like, wow, okay. I've heard of black Twitter, but I didn't know brown Twitter had any force. And I'm like, oh, we got force, because not only do we have the diaspora, like, once it got to India, it was fun, because then you got the numbers at that point. If you get the homeland involved, if you get India, Pakistan, Bangladesh involved, we got the numbers. Like, then it's gonna be a big deal.
Let's talk about religion.
Sure.
How are you religious? Do you have a big strong faith in you?
It's funny. I feel like it's a very cultural thing for me. It's like, it's one thing that I find tangible that I can hold on to. And, my mom taught us religion in a very interesting way. Like, it was very much based on stories and values, and rituals became kind of secondary, or, like, for example, like, Hindus aren't supposed to eat beef. My mom let us eat hamburgers, like, our whole life. And I didn't even know beef was against the rules until I was like 10. And somebody who was a friend, still my best friend, asked me, why am I eating beef? And I didn't know we weren't supposed to. I asked my mom much later, and she's like, it didn't bother me, because I know people who don't eat beef. I know Hindus who are strict about that, were terrible. Just because you follow this particular ritual does not mean you're a good human being. It means that you follow a rule. Mm-hmm. I want to raise kids who actually understand, what good morals and values are. and are people who can contribute to society. That has nothing to do with beef.
Right.
And that to me was like, I'm not shitting on how people choose to,
No.
follow their faith, but I'm saying that was a philosophy that she had. It was she is a very practical person in some ways. Like she's somebody who very much is much more religious than I am, is a strong, she has a lot of faith in a higher being. But at the same time, medical background. She has a science mind. She's also somebody who's very like, she's driven by science and fact, and also how can you live in this society? Like what fits here? Like she's not precious about certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, I pray every morning after my shower. Yeah. And I don't pray in a way that has any real rules.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Because I don't speak, obviously I don't know Sanskrit, and obviously like I don't, my Telugu, which is our language in Southern India, like my skills are minimal, but like I end up praying the way I pray and use the different gods as focal points. And I feel like whatever connection I have with God or whatever that essence is, it's mine, not for anyone else to debate or question. And, Hinduism is something that is, even if the Hindu rite is trying to make it this way, it is not standardized. Uh-huh. It is not something that has a clear set of instructions. It's not something that has a rule book. Hinduism has always been something village to village, town to town, has been practiced differently. There's been many different divisions, and certainly how Brahmins split people up by caste that's not universally accepted either. So let's not like pretend that like this thing is there's only one way to do it. I think that's a useful tool for right-wing politicians to, organize.
Do you have like a plan to kind of teach your kid certain rituals, traditions, maybe the language?
I feel like the language I wouldn't even be able to, which breaks my heart when I thought about that a lot, because it's like, my parents would be the link to that. Yeah. And so that's on, how long I'm lucky enough to have my parents and how, much my kid learns
language
from them.
Language carries culture.
Language carries a lot of culture. And I think that here's the thing, man, even in South Asia, South Asian languages are dying. Because English is the language of currency. So you have people who speak, let's say they speak Telugu, they don't write Telugu. They don't know how to write it. They don't know how to read it because they've been in English medium schools pretty much from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Because Telugu is not going to get you a job that pays.
No.
You need English.
Yeah.
And so why is anyone going to read things in Telugu? And more importantly, why would anybody write things in Telugu? Like my mom is telling me, Telugu literature is being destroyed. People aren't writing in it because they don't know how to, and they don't know how to read it. And I think the thing that I find most interesting is they don't know necessarily how to think in it. If you're thinking in English in a language that isn't yours to begin with, there's going to be things that are lost in translation. There's going to be thoughts that because of your mastery of language and because of the connection you have to that language, it lets you, I think even further and see your culture a certain way. Once you take language out of it, your language out of it, it's going to affect how you process things. And that really saddens me that all these years after the British left, it's now that you're really seeing the devastation of culture in a lot of ways, because like we're losing something that, it's sad enough when we lose it. Yeah. But there's something about that seems very like, well, that comes with immigration. And even if I was able to hold my language, how many generations would it last after that when it's not being practiced regularly, right? But when you're in the place, when you're in the homeland and it's dying there, that's what really hurts me, because it's like, man, but that's the root. Like if the culture is dying from the root, what do you do?
Even my cousin in Pakistan, they all speak English to me. They don't speak Urdu to me. That's crazy.
Have you seen that show Rami?
Yes, I love that show.
I love Rami, man. Do you see that episode when he goes to, there's a few episodes when he goes to Egypt and he has that cousin that just wants to speak to him in English?
Yes.
Like I get it. There's a certain sense of, it's like on one hand, we're going over there, want to get a deeper sense of connection to who we are. And then we're talking to family people who want to practice their English and have have a sense of like, hey, I'm more cosmopolitan than you think I am,
Yeah.
and there's that friction, but it's
It's
some of the
partly
stuff's in
it's partly our fault too. We don't speak our language, you know. I don't know.
I mean, look,
I don't know. I just didn't see the point of it at that
there
time.
was a time period where you had all these communities living in the same place, right? So let's say you live in a Spanish community generations, and the language is still alive there because the neighborhood speaks Spanish, right?
Yes.
Then there's a practical value in your day to day and its practice. If you like, I didn't grow up in a big Telugu community where I was always around Telugu people who were speaking it all the time. It's like, it's not that I didn't know Telugu people. I didn't have cousins. I didn't have family. And I didn't have get-togethers, or there weren't Telugu conventions and things like that. But it wasn't that a language that would be used, let's say, like Spanish would be. And so the language, just by that alone, you have to force yourself to speak it. You have to speak it in the house with your parents. And you have to be able to switch off back and forth constantly. And for us, it's like, well, English is what lets us express more complicated thoughts because we obviously know it better.
Mm-hmm.
We read in English. We watch media in English. It's a lot easier to lose the language, and we lost it. When my grandmother lived with us for a few years, we had it, but once she moved back to India, there was no way to really practice it, and it went with us. And I know that for my kid, I know most likely he might know a few words in Telugu, but I think most likely he's not going to have it. And if he does, that'd be amazing. But that's one of the losses. And it happens. And look, it's not a new phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in New York, and I'd meet kids who call themselves Italian and Irish.
And they never spoke the language.
Don't speak Italian. Never been to Ireland.
Yeah.
Don't actually know the traditions. They have their Italian American traditions. They have their Irish American traditions. They have a new set of traditions, or they have an identity that's kind of shaped on that. But that's what happens with any kind of immigration. It changes. Like, you think of brown people in Guyana or brown people in Trinidad. It's not the same thing anymore.
No.
It takes on a new form. And, am I going to say that these people are less brown as a result? No, it just means that, like, they're definitely, they're Trinidadian more than they are Indian, and I'm American more than I am Indian. Like, it just out of how could I be? And so that's just what happens when you immigrate, and you can only save culture for so long.
What about the replacement of your old culture with this new American culture? So there was a debate on Twitter about how people of different faiths, Hinduism, Islam, put up a Christmas tree during Christmas because
I mean, hell, I have a tree right now.
yeah, but you have a
My kid's also, is also like he's half.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, let's just say, a Pakistani couple who grew up in America, Canada, decided to put up a Christmas tree.
I had a Christmas tree growing up, though. My parents are Hindu. I mean, I think our thinking is, we didn't see religious value to it. We saw it as a holiday, and this is a tree. Yeah. Even in Christianity, what do pine trees have to do with Christianity? There were no pine trees in the Middle East. Where are all these white people and pine trees at Jesus' time? I think the background of the pine trees, it's actually like a Scandinavian tradition, like Yule. It's like a pagan holiday. And so they just combined the two, and now you have this one holiday from this one people, and then you have this other holiday from another people come together, and we got Christmas trees with Jesus on them. Like, it's a different, and Santa, where does that fit into anything? Do you know what I mean? So
yeah,
capitalism and immigration and the natural movement of culture changed what Christmas
and
is.
Western customs. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's kind of like a path to a different direction. A Christmas tree.
It's either you accept it or you fight it. And to us, it's like, well, this is going to be. I got Hanuman on my Christmas tree right now, man. I got Hindu gods hanging off my Christmas tree. Like, to me, it's an American holiday more than it's a religious holiday. You can practice it in a religious way.
Yeah.
But like if
Halloween.
I see like Halloween, yeah, like look, if I see statues of Jesus in a courthouse, I'm going to be pissed because I'm like, this is a separation of church and state in this country. If I see a Christmas tree in Santa, I'm fine with it. You know what I mean? Because at that point, that's the universal part of it. That's the part that anyone can have presents. Anyone can have a tree. Decorating a tree is fun. My kid's going to have a fun time doing that. The religion has been so, like Christianity has been mainstreamed and capitalism has had its way with it. Whenever they talk about Christianity being like taken away in this country or there's a war on it, no, there isn't. There is no war on Christmas. And if there is, it's capitalism that has the war. It's changed the meaning of this thing. So, to me, it's not a religious holiday in that way. Like Ramadan is a religious holiday. It's hard to mainstream that. See what I mean?
It's not a fun thing.
There's no bush, there's no tree, there's no special stick, there's no
hungry. You're just hungry.
It's a very, you know what I mean? But
it's
this
very
thing
anti-capitalistic.
In that way, there's no hook. There's at least like there's a tree involved, and there's this. Are there? I mean, you tell me, brother, because I don't know. Are there Ramadan sales? Do mattresses come cheap? There's still a religious connection that's deep.
Yeah.
This is a tree connected to a place where Jesus is not even from.
Yes.
None of this makes sense. So to me, would I have a cross in my house? No. Probably not. My kid becomes Christian, that's his right. But a tree's a tree, and it that to me that I don't see any connection. I mean, that's the thing. Culture. I think people assume that culture is stagnant. Culture in India isn't the same as it was when my parents were there. Culture from one part of India to another part of India isn't the same. It varies by religion, by like language, by food and customs. There's no consistency. India pre-British colonialism and post-British colonialism are completely different things. Like the history keeps moving. Culture is not the same thing. The one thing you would hope, though, is that you can impact culture equally to the way it impacts you. That's the part that's always been unfair, right? Like the West you have colonizers, they come in, they might take, curry with them, but they're also taking like our natural resources and our wealth. It's like this unfair thing where we're forced to speak English because that's what's going to get us jobs, and that's the thing that's going to. But they don't respect our stuff, and when they do respect our stuff, it's cultural appropriation because they're using it to make money, or they're using it for points and status. It's not like a equal. I'm putting something out. Like when we talk about cultural things, we're made fun of. Curry smells funny. Why are you wearing that dot? If Gwen Stefani's wearing that dot, it's fine because it's fashion at that point. You know what I mean? And that's the part that's frustrating to me. Culture's going to change. You can hold on to whatever you can hold on to, but it's never going to look the same. If my parents never left India and I was born there, it wouldn't look the same. I know more about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and all these Hindu epics. I know more about it than most of my cousins in India. I can guarantee that. And oftentimes, like, and you hear this, like people who convert end up being more fanatical than the people that were born with it.
Yeah. And
that's true kind of across the board because they're desperately trying to hold on to something, right? It gives them meaning. If you're born into it, you just kind of, it's like I'm in New York. I've never been to the Statue of Liberty. I was born and raised here. But if I was a tourist, I'm going to go to the Statue of Liberty. Because like to me, it's just so part of the thing. You don't even think about making it a part of your journey. And I think the same thing is true with culture oftentimes, or religion. It's like, I'm just living in it. I don't need all that other stuff. I'm living in it and I'm making a life without having to prove anything to myself or other people. And I think that's different. When you say you're from New York, you don't need to show them pictures of you at the Statue of Liberty. If you're a tourist, hey, I went to New York, here's me at the Statue of Liberty. It takes on a completely different meaning. Hey, brother, I should probably leave soon because I got a baby I got to take care of.
All right, sorry, man. Yeah, I'm good. We have an hour.
Man, this has been really fun.
You want to add in? You want to tell the audience something? There's a big South Asian community listening to you.
I mean, first, everyone should follow Brown History because I love your Instagram, man.
Don't do that. Let's talk.
Dude, I love your Instagram account. I think it gives us so much in terms of, just little pieces of things. Like I've read things and then Googled stuff after based on like a post. Like your posts are pretty like straightforward, but they spark ideas. And they give me a little bit of culture or like light a match I didn't think about before, and it makes me have to look into our culture and how we got here. It adds so much, and there's a reason why you have so many followers and so many of us in the community value it. So,
do you know how ironic this conversation is? Because your documentary is what gave me the courage to make that page, and two, I would read your interviews and I would try to find out what books you like, and then you recommended a book called Vijay Prasad,
Karma of Brown Folks.
And then I read that book because you said it was changed your life. And then I read that, and then I got hungry for more knowledge, and it led me to this path, and here we are talking to each other.
Oh, this makes my day.
Isn't that crazy?
This makes my day. That's amazing, man. Well, I mean, that I think people should sign up to your page. And selfishly, I'll say you should watch my Netflix special, Warn Your Relatives. And
you should Netflix show. You should watch it.
Everyone should watch it. And The Problem with Apu's available on HBO Max. So if you're in the States, there's ways to do it. So and also podcast Politically Reactive with W. Kamau Bell and me every Thursday. And my brother and I have a podcast, the Kondabolu Brothers podcast, or the Untitled Kondabolu Brothers Project. We like to call it a pop-up podcast. We don't know, we release it in small batches. We don't know when.
It's just a nice way of saying you don't have a schedule.
No schedule whatsoever. It shows up when it shows up. But if I'm assuming people who are listening to this, many of them care about cultural content, the idea of South Asian identity in different places. We do a lot of that on our show. It's very different because it's a relationship between two brothers, but like. It's a very, I think for people who are either South Asian or regardless if you're South Asian, if you have siblings, if you have that kind of close connection to family, I think this show is our podcast is really fun for a lot of people because I think it is relatable. They can identify with it. So yeah, I would say the Kondabolu Brothers podcast is another thing people here might want to check out.
Awesome. Great.
Brother, so nice to meet you. Thank you for having me on.
It's an honor to meet you.
Ditto, man.
See ya.